much and good afternoon. I will start my presentation by a series of apologies. First, apologies for the informal dress code. My former Israeli identity prescribes this informal dress code, and my current British identity forces me to apologize for this informal dress code. Second apology is that the subject is slightly different from the original one, but the arguments are pretty much the same. Instead of talking about tolerating other people's religion, I will talk about tolerating religious conscientious objection. So slightly narrower, but pretty much the same. Last apology, because I'm a legal philosopher, that the presentation will be, well, philosophical by its nature. So you can either like it or hate it, but there you go. The common view when we talk about the state, normally the secular state, tolerating religious conscientious objections, or in fact any kind of conscientious objection, the common view would be that freedom of religion and freedom of conscience are grounded in autonomy. The main arguments that I would like to develop in the next 15 minutes or so is first that it is not true that a typical religious conscientious objector have a choice when they decide to act upon their conscience. Secondly, it is not true that a typical conscientious objector exercise their autonomy when developing or acquiring their conscience, meaning in the preliminary stage before they act upon this conscience. And I will try to describe in brief a few analytical and normative implications of these lack of choice arguments. Before developing the argument themselves, I will say a few brief words about some pivotal concepts in order for us to have common ground for later arguments. When I talk about conscience, I refer to something which is a source of higher demands to which a person sees himself as subordinate. And a conscience is different from deeply held moral beliefs. We all have deeply held moral beliefs. Only few of us actually have a conscience. And we know that our deepest held moral beliefs are in fact part of our conscience if we are willing to follow our deepest moral beliefs no matter what. Or if we are willing, or if we do follow our deepest moral beliefs, even in the face of severe sanction or punishment. When I talk about conscientious objection, I refer to unwillingness to perform an act that contradicts one's conscience without having any intention to bring about a change in the law or in existing policies. So the typical conscientious objector is a selfish person. He does not, or she does not aspire to change the law, to bring about a change in policy, to create a massive popular support for a change in the policy on the law. The only motive of the conscientious objector is to be able to follow one's conscience without suffering meaningful sanction or punishment. And as to autonomy, being autonomous person means being able to make our own choices and having an adequate range of valuable options from which we are able to choose. So we need an adequate range of options. These options should be valuable for us, and we should be able to choose between these options without being manipulated, without being forced or threatened to choose a certain option. We can have an adequate range of options, but if they are not valuable to us, then we are not autonomous, obviously. If I give you a choice between being killed by a tiger, a cobra, or a crocodile, then you have a choice. You have an adequate range of options. None of these options is valuable. So you do have a choice, but you are not really autonomous, or in fact, you don't really have a choice. When the only choice that you have is to decide how you are going to be assassinated or murdered. As to the lack of choice regarding acting upon our conscience. Martin Luther's argument, famous argument, was that here I stand, I can do no other. Apparently, Martin Luther didn't really say these words, but this is beside the point, because they are sufficiently important. They make a point according to which the conscientious objector doesn't have a choice. He can't do otherwise, he can't do anything but following one's conscience. And I will come back to this argument shortly, but first I would like to address just two or a few possible objections to the lack of choice argument. I have no choice but to follow my conscience. First, there's the reasons-responsive and reason-guiding views of compatibilist control. I will not elaborate on this point. I will just say that some people argue that conscientious objectors do respond to reason, do respond to change in circumstances. They may choose to change their behavior. They may choose not to act upon their conscience if they face severe punishment or sanctions or threat of severe punishments or sanctions. However, both research and real life prove that this is not in fact the case. A conscientious objector, if one is a sincere conscientious objector, is non-responsive to reasons. He will act, she will act upon their conscience no matter what. They will risk their lives, they will risk their jobs, they will risk their well-being because they don't really have the choice, because their conscience compels on them to do something or refrain from doing that something. The strongest argument against the lack of choice argument would be that the requisite autonomy can be traced back to the period of time over which the contents of one's conscience was developed. So people may argue that once we have a conscience, we don't really have a choice. We will follow our conscience no matter what, or in the face of severe punishment or sanctions. However, we get to choose that conscience to begin with. So we do have a choice. We choose our conscience, and after we choose our conscience, then we don't have a real choice. So the lack of choice argument with regard to the content of one's conscience. My argument is that it is highly implausible to suppose that the development of conscience is something that flows from or can be traced to autonomous choices. And we can establish this argument by referring to evidence regarding free choice more generally, and evidence regarding moral commitments and beliefs. The general evidence suggests that our general character, commitments, are shaped by forces beyond our control. That will be a hardcore determinist point of view, that across the board, generally speaking, we don't really have a choice about anything, really. A more specific argument would say that we may have a choice regarding preferences, our characters, and so on, characteristics, but we don't have a choice regarding our deepest moral commitments and belief, or conscience. Let's start with the first general argument. Well, you can read it for yourself, but the more I read, the more I'm convinced that we don't really have a choice, that our preferences, tastes, character, and acts are all the result of fixed points on which we have no control. If we take preferences and tastes, for example, and that will be the easy case, I think. We don't get to choose our preferences or our tastes. You either like vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream. You can't choose to like or to prefer vanilla ice cream. You either prefer hot weather or cold weather. It is hardly a matter of choice. And this applies to more important things, less trivial things. You can't choose to fall in love. You can't choose to be attracted to someone or to be repelled by another. You are all these things because of fixed points which exist. And they exist because of reasons that sometimes are beyond our understanding, and sometimes there are reasons that we know, but we didn't have any control on them. As to character and acts, yet again, we can be either shy or self-confident. We can be lazy or hardworking. We can be cowards or braves. But we can't choose to be these things. This is simply who we are. And we are who we are because of things beyond our control. These things can be either born characteristics, for example, genes, brain activity, and so on, but this can also relate to socialization. And there's no need to decide a dispute between born characteristics or born features and socialization, because both are beyond our control. As to the more specific argument regarding conscience and deepest beliefs, the emerging consensus is that moral conscience is the causal product of a basic genetically endowed cognitive architecture that is then molded by the cultural and social environment of the individual agent. So we are born in having certain characteristics, having certain personal features, and I only realized that only after my second son was born. My first child was a relaxed, easygoing, quiet, shy child from the moment he was born. My second child, however, is the complete opposite. He's a cheeky little monster. And he lives in the same family, the same parents, he lives in the same environment. He was simply born that way. He was that way from the moment he was born. And then we had to try to change him, but with very moderate success. So if this is true, then we have an analytical implication and a normative implication. The analytical implication is that if conscientious objections are tolerated by the state, they are tolerated also because of the lack of ability to choose one's conscience and to refrain from acting upon it. The normative point of view, the normative implication would be that the lack of choice argument is always a reason for tolerating conscientious objection. Just a reason. We have other reasons why not to tolerate conscientious objections, but the lack of choice argument is always a reason for tolerating objections. Let's start with the analytical implication and then move on to the normative if I have time. As to the analytical argument, this is the common view. Right? Many of the arguments trade at bottom on a simple idea, namely that being able to choose what to believe and how to live makes for a better life. Being told what you must believe and how you must live make lives worse, which is true, but then it ignores the third possibility, that we don't really have a choice. And if you don't have a choice, it means that there is something in between choosing what to believe and how to live and being told what to believe and how to live. And the third way, if you wish, or the something in between is that we don't have a choice regarding what to believe and how to live, yet it is still important that we will be able to follow our beliefs, to be able to live according to our non-chosen beliefs. Which means that when we use concepts like freedom of conscience or freedom of religion, we use concepts which are misguided because we are not really free. Freedom of conscience or freedom of religion doesn't really protect the right to choose to do X, for example, as much as it protects the right to simply do X, without being subjected to sanctions. So the freedom of religion, for example, is not about the freedom to choose one's religion, because there is no choice at this point. And it's also not the freedom to act upon one's religious belief, because there is no choice at this point. The only freedom is the freedom to do something, to follow one's beliefs, religious or conscientious, without being subjected to sanctions. I think that the lack of choice argument explains well the fascinating dual nature of our conscience, because our conscience is both an inner part of our deepest and personal moral beliefs or values. This is part of our moral personhood, part of our moral integrity. This is perhaps the most personal thing that we have, yet at the same time, our conscience is not really our conscience. It is an external source of moral commands. And I think that we have an intuitive feeling that this is in fact true because this is the language that we use when we talk about our conscience. We talk about dictates of conscience, commands of conscience. I was forced by my conscience to do X, for example. We don't talk about advices of conscience. The conscientious objector doesn't say, my conscience suggested that I would do X or Y. When we talk about dictates of conscience, commands of conscience, we imply that we don't really have a choice. If we could choose our conscience, that how can something that we choose can dictate our behavior? If we can always choose our conscience, choose it, change it, decide whether or not to follow it, then there are no dictates and there are no commands. And one conscientious objector put this view in a very nice way when, actually she said, when she was a conscientious objector, acted upon her conscience and was arrested because of that, I felt both that I was acting completely freely and that I could not possibly act otherwise, that I was expressing my essential self and that I was bearing an impersonal witness, which brings us back to the dual nature of conscience. It is part of our personality, part of our moral personhood, yet an external source of commands. As to the general normative argument, there's a general question in the philosophical writing about freedom of conscience. What is the source of the distinction between conscience, conscientious convictions, and mere preferences? Why do the state normally willing to tolerate conscientious objectors by granting them conscientious exemptions from generally applicable laws, yet the state would never exempt from the application of the law people who object to the law merely because of their preferences? Why do we think that it is morally right to sometime exempt conscientious objectors from the application of the law, yet we will hardly ever agree that people who object to the law because of their preferences should be exempted from the application of the law? There are three possible answers here. The answer about vulnerability, lack of choice, and moral personhood. Vulnerability can't explain the distinction between preferences and conscientious convictions because both people who hold certain preferences and people who hold certain conscientious beliefs, both kind of people are vulnerable in terms of being exposed to demands of the law. The law can run against our personal preferences in the same way that the law can run against our conscientious beliefs. The lack of choice argument also can't explain the distinction between preferences and conscientious beliefs because the lack of choice argument applies equally to both. We don't get to choose our preferences and we don't get to choose our conscientious beliefs as well. Moral personhood can explain the distinction between conscientious beliefs and preferences, but up to a certain extent. Obviously, if we are not allowed to follow our conscientious beliefs, if we face sanctions or punishments because we follow our conscientious beliefs, which contradict the demands of the law, then we have a choice between two evils. The first choice, or decision, because we don't really have a choice, the first decision would be to follow our conscience, but then to suffer from severe punishment, bad option. The second option is to follow the law and to act against our conscience, thus suffering immense harm to our moral personhood. That will diminish our moral personhood, another bad option. This is not the case with regard to preferences. If the law runs against my preferences, I do have a choice, which is not really a choice, between two bad options: obeying the law or following my preferences and suffer a sanction. But no harm to my moral personhood will be caused if I decide to obey the law while ignoring my preferences. But the moral personhood reason is not quite enough, because if we do have a choice about our conscience, if we can choose our conscience, if we can choose whether to act upon it, then the state can simply say, if the law contradicts your conscience, simply change your conscience or decide not to act upon it. And if you decide, if you choose, because you have a choice, if you choose to act upon your conscience which contradicts the law, then you should bear the consequences. So what can explain the distinction between preferences and convictions? The combination of the moral personhood reason and the lack of choice reason. It is morally problematic not to exempt a person from the application of the law because that person is a conscientious objector, if that person can't choose one's conscience, if that person can't choose whether to follow one's consciences, and if not following one's conscience results in grave harm to moral personhood. Finally, my argument up till now was a moral argument, and we can put together points 2 and 3. The fact that a conscientious objector can't choose their conscience, and the fact that they can't really choose whether to act upon their conscience, always provides a reason for the state to exempt conscientious objectors from the application of the law. Why? Because people should not be morally responsible for things that they can't control, for things that are beyond their control. You can't hold people morally responsible if they can't decide to act otherwise. That will be a moral reason for tolerating religious and non-religious conscientious objections. However, there can also be other reasons for not tolerating the conscientious objector. And I will not elaborate on these reasons now, but the fact that conscientious objectors don't have a choice doesn't necessarily mean that they should not be legally responsible for deciding to act upon their conscience. They are not morally responsible because they can't do otherwise, yet they can still be legally responsible, for example, in cases in which when a person follows one's conscience, the result will be harming third parties or violating rights of others. In that case, we will acknowledge the fact that the conscientious objector can't act differently. At the same time, we will refuse granting them exemption from the law in order to protect rights or important interests of others, for example. Which means that the lack of choice argument is not a trump card. It's not a conclusive reason for tolerating conscientious objections. It's merely a reason that should always be taken into account when the state has to decide whether to tolerate conscientious objections. Do I still have time? It can't be the case that I'm talking for less than 15 minutes. Okay. I'm sure that I'm talking more than 15 minutes, but no one said anything. So thank you very much.